Hello and welcome to this episode of Logos Education Podcast. Today we're joined by Chenrui to talk about her life at Oxford studying English. Chenrui, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Joshua?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for coming on. I'm sure the viewers will be very interested to hearing what it's like to study English at Oxford. To get started off with, what were some of the struggles and also how did you find adapting to your Oxford degree?
I think one of the struggles is it can sometimes be, especially as a humanities student, you will definitely have times when you feel lonely. Um, and I think it's probably because when you're STEM students and you have problem shoots, or when you're medic students and you're working in a lab together, there are opportunities for collaboration. You can ask what'd you get for 2A? And you can work through things together. But for humanities students, because you are all writing your own essays, which could be on very different topics and very different texts and writers, it's very difficult to have that same level of peer collaboration. So I think the one thing you have to get used to is to be lonely in order to think more deeply about what you're writing. And just because it's something that comes with being a humanities student from the way you work. Something that surprised me, um, it's probably the people. I think there is a bit of a stereotype of what someone who goes to Oxford is like, and often that stereotype is private school, white male, very privileged, very posh accent, knows all sorts of random trivia facts in pub quizzes. But what you find is that whilst there are definitely people like that, there are so many other people who are incredibly lovely, who come from all walks of life and all countries around the world. And it's the sense of you will find your people. You don't have to settle and you don't have to change yourself in order to settle just because of the people within your proximity. The right people will come and the right people will stick.
I guess the idea of loneliness is something which is a very strong thing. I guess as a humanities student myself as well, I sometimes find myself going 3 days or 4 days without actually really interacting with anyone apart from maybe my
Yeah.
tutor at their tutorial one time. And we will talk about societies in a bit, but can you tell us perhaps some of the ways apart from, I guess, maybe going to the JCR a bit more to that really
Mm.
help you face that challenge of loneliness?
I think this is something I'm working on as well, and something that I'm trying to do better on myself. But it's the idea of the first people you meet when you go to uni do not have to be, your friends till death do you apart. And it's about going to events and building friendships based on some sort of established mutual interest or established mutual value. So it could be maybe you both really enjoy playing squash together and you meet each other at the squash club or squash society. Or it could be, you both love Star Wars and you meet each other at the Star Wars sock. Um, but going to things where you have a mutually established shared interest can be a very helpful and healthy way to grow friendships. I think one piece of advice that could pertain to Oxford in particular is definitely make friends outside of your college. I think it's great if you can have like a bit of a support system in college because that will be where you are a lot of the time. But it's really nice to have friends that are not from college or a little bit more distance from your day-to-day life, um, who you can go to get sometimes it's like a third person perspective on things that are going on when you're asking for advice, or sometimes it's just when college becomes a bit too much and you just want to get out and kind of be able to really um, calm down and think things through more clearly without sometimes the drama and the everyone knows everyone-ness of college.
That sounds like a very good tip. I mean, I really am very grateful for all my friends around the Catholic chaplaincy, and we know that we
Yeah.
have some mutual friends there as well. And having that support group outside of college is definitely something very helpful, especially if you're getting cancelled in college. I will not say too much about that, but but it is
For
definitely
another
something
day.
which that's for another day indeed. But it is something which could be very helpful. Perhaps moving on to studying at Oxford itself, we talked a bit about tutorials in our last interview, but can you tell us a bit more about what tutorials are like as an Oxford student?
Of course, of course. I can tell you what they're like as an English student. So every term I get two tutors, and those two tutors will be teaching two different topics. So this term it's kind of 1350 to 1550 medieval English for one tutor, and then for the other tutor, it's 18th century literature. And every week, one tutor will give us an essay, and then it kind of alternates. And we will write the essay. We'll have a week to write the essay, do the reading, choose our text, often choose our question as well. And then we send the essay off. And in our tutorial, we'll sit with one or two other people and we'll talk through the essay. We'll talk through our essays, we'll get feedback on them, and we'll get kind of challenged on various points in our essay and various arguments that we make. And when I say challenge, this can range from just talk to me a bit more about this one point you've made, to why do you think this is the basis for your entire essay? So really challenging anything from specific semantics to the entire concept behind your argument.
Now, I guess one of the initial concerns that someone might have when they're going into a tutorial is that oftentimes they're sitting next to someone who's a renowned scholar in the field. For example, my tutor for Locke is a Kantian scholar and knows almost everything about everything in this field. And sometimes you could feel very intimidated by the situation. What would be your words of, I guess, encouragement to maybe a high school student currently who's like, I'm not sure whether I'll feel comfortable sitting next to such a renowned scholar?
Yeah, I get that. It can definitely be scary, and it can definitely feel intimidating as you're kind of shadowed by their incredible knowledge relative to your puny attempts at knowledge. But to counter that, I would say your opinion and what you think is just as valuable as what any critic has ever thought. And this was a point that was really driven home to me on one of my essays I wrote, where at the beginning of one paragraph, well, at the end of one paragraph, I was talking about a critic's point of view, and I kind of summed it up in a sentence. And at the start of the next paragraph, I had just written, "But I disagree." Full stop. And my tutor had written next to that a big tick and like a very emphatic good. So it's the sense of you are actively encouraged to disagree and to think critically and independently, and to know, and the basis of you thinking critically and independently is that your critical and independent thought is just as valuable as any critic's, critical and independent thought. So once again, be confident in your ideas, be prepared to fight for them, but also be prepared to change your minds if you genuinely think that one of the things you had assumed in your views you think is actually, well, I'm not sure I believe in that assumption anymore. So therefore, I think I'm going to change my views.
Hmm. I guess a kind of interesting question on a side tangent. How often do you actually put your own views in your essays? Because sometimes, although most of the times I do argue from my perspective in my essays, sometimes I'll
Hmm.
be like, okay, for the sake of this essay, I'm just going to write a good essay and just make some argument that I don't really agree with, but I'll do it anyways. How much does that kind of personal
Hmm.
interest in the field overlay the
Oh,
academic ease of it, perhaps?
you see, I think this is interesting because I think English is one of maybe the only degrees where, because I understand for philosophy and theology, you are still bound to, you have to kind of learn how other philosophers think and then have that kind of cement your ideas to be like, well, I think this because I disagree with this person or because I agree with that person. Whereas for English, it's almost the other way round in that we start with just the primary text of a book or a poem or a play, and then we think, what do we think about it? What do I think about it? How does this make me feel? How do I find myself reacting to this piece of text? And then once we have established our initial thoughts, we then go and read criticism to be like, okay, now that I think this, what do other people think about it? And we use other people's thoughts to refine our own. So say I am reading Romeo and Juliet, and I'm like, you know what? I find Romeo so annoying. I think he is indecisive and impulsive, and that is my initial view of Romeo. And then I go out to read some other critics' view of Romeo, and some of them are like, well, actually, he is a brave and a noble-hearted soul, and I'm like, well, that critic says he's a brave and noble-hearted soul, but would a brave and noble-hearted soul do X, Y, and Z? And then maybe another critic is like, well, actually, Romeo is a very heinous villain because he does these absolutely unnecessary things and all these machinations. And you take that critic and you're like, well, I don't think he's a villain exactly. Admittedly, I don't think any critic has ever said he was. But it's the sense of you start with your own ideas and you use secondary reading to refine your own ideas. And I think that makes English an incredibly unique subject because I can't really think of any other subject where you can start with a piece of blank paper and the text and just have your original thoughts.
That sounds like a very important thing. And you talked a bit about how you're fighting for your ideas in a tutorial, which is definitely a very passionate way to describe it. But perhaps for a high school student, they're not very used to that one-on-one contact with a tutor. How would someone perhaps develop skills to interact or fight for those ideas? Yes.
I think the best way to get used to, I wouldn't say it's so much adversarial as kind of this Socratic dialogue between tutor and tutee, is to know your text really well. It's to know what your argument is and the basis of your argument very well. And by that, I mean that in an essay, we usually think of it in paragraphs and, with one point kind of flowing on to the next and all building up to maybe a grander point. But it can be helpful to walk into a tutorial re-envisioning your essay as a kind of very clear, just, point one, evidence A, evidence B, evidence C, point two, evidence A, evidence B, evidence C, and seeing it in a much more logical and structured way. I find that is a lot more helpful than just giving like a much more verbose expansion of what your essay is about. So I think being concise and structured and knowing your text really well is probably what would help most.
That definitely is a very helpful tip for entering into the tutorial setting. Perhaps taking a step back, you've talked about writing an essay. What is the general process of writing an essay for you, and what are some of the topics like, or what are some of the essay prompts in Oxford English?
This is very interesting. I wonder how you write essays too, Joshua, because from what I've heard from my practice and from different people's practice, people write them completely differently. So we've got people who can do the reading and writing like 48 hours before the deadline. Do they get sleep? I am not sure. I am concerned to find out. And then you've got people who kind of take it slow. I would say that for me, I don't tend to do multiple drafts. It's kind of like I kind of just do one draft and I send it off. But my problem is that I perfect it word by word, which is not always a great thing to do because you don't really need it to be perfect. You just need it to be finished. And that's a lesson I learned the hard way in especially in my first year when I felt really overwhelmed by essays. I felt like I was not doing it perfectly because I thought it was too much, because I didn't really know how to choose questions, or I didn't really know how to analyze things. I just didn't know how to write an essay. So I think the biggest takeaway, no matter how you write essays, is it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be done. You can improve by writing the next essay, not by spending hours and hours and hours drafting and redrafting and perfecting and reperfecting this one weekly essay.
Yeah, I definitely sympathize with that. I used to have like 5 or 6 drafts to make the last project very good in first year.
Oh,
I don't know how
wow.
I don't know how I had that much time to do that though, because I was writing 2 essays a week and I was able to do 6 drafts for each of them. So I'm not sure how
Wow.
that was even possible. Now I just write one draft, read through it once, correct any small grammatical errors. Because the way I write essays is I just kind of do all my reading in one day. And then the next day I just have any inspirations. I'm like, that day I'm just writing on my inspiration. And then I just like start writing. It's very based on inspirations. The word comes into my mind and I just like write it down and then that's the essay. So it's very messy, but I'll fix it after one draft. But then oftentimes, if I don't have any inspiration, nothing comes to my mind, I get very stuck. If the words just don't come, I'm just like sitting there. I'm like, what should I write? What should I write? And then I write a very dry essay. But then those dry essays are normally considered as better essays in the academic sense because I'm like, okay, I need a thesis, some analysis of that, some sources, and then continue that on. And then it's very structured, but it's very dry, and I really don't like them. But that's the way my essays are somewhat formulated. But perhaps moving on from essays to lectures, how do you find English lectures?
This is a good question. English lectures are definitely not like history lectures. Let's define through comparison, right? So I think for history lectures, having been to a couple, and perhaps for philosophy as well, you can chip in. It's like we're going to learn about what this historian thought, or rather philosopher thought, or we're going to learn about what happened in this segment of history. You go there to learn. With English lectures, I would argue you go there to unlearn, in the sense of with an English lecture, a lot of the time you go in there with assumptions made about a text, and the lecture is about revealing and then unraveling your assumptions of the text. So you walk away with more questions than you do answers, which means if you walk in there without having a very good knowledge of the text, things are not going to go well. But if you walk in there with a pretty good knowledge or base knowledge of the text and what the lecture is going to be about, you walk away with a much more nuanced and complex and profound understanding of the text because because you are introduced to ways of questioning assumptions that you maybe never knew you had. Like one of them in your first year, as part of, there are compulsory lectures and then there's optional lectures. As part of the compulsory lectures, there is a series called The English Language and kind of Introduction to the English Language. And one lecture that has really stuck with me and still remains with me to this day is just, what is metaphor? What is metaphor? That absolutely probes at our ideas of what metaphor is. And it looks at a book called Metaphors We Live By, I think, by Lakoff, ? But it's essentially looking at how metaphor is not just a poetic idea confined to literary poetry, but rather it is so ingrained within our language that metaphor is almost like a form of thought. There's a classic thing of anything that is up is good and anything that is down is bad, which is why we say high-spirited or low-spirited, or sometimes we can just say, oh, I'm feeling low. or I'm on a high, or it's these interesting connections that are made between ideas and language connected through metaphor. But that is just a very small instance of what a lecture can do. It can take something that we assume we know and completely unravel it.
That sounds like a very interesting approach to lectures. It seems way more useful, and I don't want to say too much without getting on the blacklist of my philosophy department. But it definitely is a different approach, and a very helpful approach to lectures as a whole. You said you have to go into lectures with some base knowledge. So what are some things you do to prepare for that lecture? Is that you've done some reading beforehand, or what is that form of preparation?
Yeah, I think it's just usually the lecture will be centered on a text or an author. And it's just, you don't have to go to all the lectures. In fact, I don't think it's physically possible to go to all of the lectures. But it's just if, for instance, you are reading a text or author for your weekly reading, you can also go to that lecture. But it's just whatever the writer or text is that the lecture is based on, making sure you know it, or
So,
at least have some idea of it.
yes. Now that seems like a very important thing, because when I go to my lectures, I rarely do any reading or any understanding of it. I go in, but then I guess that's a benefit of having it more of an informational thing. You don't really need to know much about it, and it comes
Yeah.
in quite a easy, bite-sized way. But perhaps moving on to our final part of the interview about your life at Oxford. What are some societies or extracurricular activities that you've discovered or you're working on currently?
Oh, this is a really good question. One thing that I've really enjoyed, to my big surprise, is choir. So before uni, I'd never done any choir, or any singing really. And then I decided to join my college chapel choir. Um, well, actually, my main motivation was that after Evensong, which is like the main performance on a Sunday evening for those who aren't religious, um, you get free food. So that was my key motivation for joining. But throughout choir, I've been really, really surprised by kind of what I've learned through choir. So specifically, one thing that your college choir will do is that it will sponsor singing lessons with some fantastic singing teachers in Oxford. And we get the excellent David Crown, who's just an amazing man, an amazing teacher. And I remember having my very first singing lesson with David, and we were covering, so I was like, am I a soprano? Because in the choir, there are 4 voices. There's soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So the girls are usually soprano or alto. And I thought I was alto because I thought my voice was a bit deeper. And he said, nope, you are a soprano. You are definitively a soprano. And more interesting was, I thought, but why is that? Because I'm really struggling to reach the higher notes. And he said, okay, well, let's just try the higher notes. And we would just, I would try the higher notes, and I would just sound so croaky and ugly, and I would just stop. And he would say, don't stop, sing louder. And I was feeling so just panicking. So I thought, well, I sound awful. I'm just going to sound awful on a bigger scale. But I tried it. I kind of tried to push through this discomfort at sounding really ugly, to reach the higher notes. And funny enough, you find that when you sing it loud enough, you do reach those higher notes. So afterwards, I did have a small chat with David, and he said it's very interesting because obviously I teach a lot of singers here at Oxford, and what you find is students have this idea of perfectionism that is very inhibiting, in the sense of you need to allow yourself to sound ugly. You are not allowing yourself to sound ugly in order to reach the higher notes. And that was a lot, that for me was much food for thought. The idea of allowing yourself to sound ugly, or, write badly, or whatever it is, in order to reach the higher notes.
So you've talked a bit about the choir, and that's, I guess, a bit of a community that's you've joined and you get to meet people. Another community which is very strong in the Oxford system is the JCRs. Now, that being said, I'm never really part of the JCR. I never show up to anything. The only time I go in is in the college bar if they're showing some football. But all that aside, what would you say is perhaps your experience with the JCR, and perhaps how is the Balliol JCR like?
The Balliol JCR is probably defined by its kind of friendliness. I think we are a very friendly and quite liberal, quite liberal community. So currently, in my first year, I was barely involved with the JCR at all because I wasn't quite sure what they did, and it kind of felt a little bit beyond me. But in second year, I have taken up the role of academic affairs and careers officer, and that's been really fun. So this week we've just invited Apollo Global Management to come over and give a talk on what a career in alternative asset management could look like. But it's just, I think the Balliol JCR is a really good way of getting to know the people at Balliol. Like, it's a great way of being part of your college community. That said, I don't think it's something you need to particularly stress about. Like, if you want to do it, that's great. If you don't want to do it, that's also fine. But I think more important than almost a JCR in a sense is kind of knowing what, who, and where your college welfare is. I find that can be quite. Those are some pretty important contexts that you need to have in your handbook of the daily student life.
That's a very important and a very interesting expression of the JCR. I mean, I didn't even know academic affairs and careers officer was a position in the JCR. But at the same time, Regents is a very small place, so we might not even have one. So I'm not sure about that, I have to say. But perhaps to end off this interview, and I ask this to all of our guests, what's the craziest thing that has happened to you since arriving in Oxford?
Well, this is quite embarrassing, but I think like maybe 2 weeks ago, I set fire to the microwave. and I'm not proud of it. And I'm not sure how either, because all I did was try to make instant ramen. And I think I was. Do you know that ramen brand that's like the chicken, and it's Korean?
Yes.
And it's super spicy? I had a pot of those, and I just put it in the microwave. And what I'd done is I'd filled it with some water. I was going to just like microwave it for 1.5 minutes or something. And I just saw at some point, like, you know how there's the paper flat?
Yes.
The paper flat was touching the top. And that to me did not occur to me that that was an issue or a potential issue. So like 1 minute in, I just start smelling smoke. I'm like, what is going on? And then I look into the microwave door, and it's just on fire. There's just flames inside this microwave. So my first thought is, whatever I do, I can't open that door. So hopefully it will just die away because of a lack of oxygen. And then I turn off the microwave. At this point, my flatmate very conveniently walks in and she's like, "Hi, Chenrui." And I'm like, "Get out. The microwave is on fire." So we rush out. We smash we don't smash, we lightly tap the fire alarm button, and then we walk out, and then you just see everyone else being like, "Oh, not another fire alarm." And I was standing there feeling extraordinarily guilty and hoping that our entire flat didn't catch on fire. Yeah.
That has to be on the top of one of the responses I've gotten so far. That's actually insane.
But the best thing is the saga doesn't end there. So we return, and we can't use our microwave anymore. But the best thing is, I think after that incident, So after that incident, everything else in our kitchen stopped working. So our toaster stopped working, our hob stopped working, our fridges just wouldn't turn on. And then that kind of got to college. And then like the week after, I think college started giving everyone a new microwave because they were concerned that other people might set the microwave on fire.
Ooh,
Yeah. Because
getting an upgrade.
we walked into college and we just saw this massive shipment of brand new microwaves that were the exact same model that they had given us to replace our microwave. So repercussions.
Oh, wonderful. Well, it always takes one mistake to make everything go get improved, I guess. So they have you to thank for the new microwaves, I guess.
I guess.
No. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this interview. Like always, if you
Very much
enjoy this
so.
type of videos, like and subscribe. I'll see you soon. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you next one.